I folded the last cardboard flap and pushed the empty box against the wall with the others. 3 weeks in Millfield, Vermont, and I'd finally gotten everything where it belonged. The rental house wasn't much to look at, but the price was right. And honestly, after the chaos of city life, I needed somewhere quiet to reset. Charlie lay on the hardwood floor near the couch, his tail giving a lazy thump when I walked past. The place had good bones, old but solid, with thick walls that kept the noise down to almost nothing. Perfect for what I needed. Those first few weeks passed without incident. I'd picked up some freelance work that kept me busy during the day, took Charlie for long walks through the surrounding woods, and slowly started to feel like I'd made the right choice coming here. The locals seemed friendly enough in that reserved New England way. Nobody bothered me. Nobody asked too many questions about why I'd come to their small town. Robert Wilson, my landlord, had been straightforward during our phone calls before I moved in. Fair rent, no weird lease terms, just a simple month-to-month arrangement. He lived on the other side of town and mostly left me alone, which suited me fine. I was starting to think I'd found the perfect quiet corner of the world. Then the first Wednesday of the month arrived. Charlie and I were in the living room around mid-afternoon. I'd been working on my laptop while he slept in a patch of late sunlight. The day felt completely ordinary. No storms coming, no construction happening nearby. Nothing to suggest what was coming. At 3:47 p.m., everything went crazy. The sound hit like a physical force, a thunderous, deep noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once, coming up through the floorboards and pressing down from above. It wasn't just loud, it was huge, like a freight train or a giant drum. The entire house shook. Books fell from shelves, picture frames rattled against the walls, and the windows shook so hard I thought they might break. I jumped up from the couch, my laptop sliding to the floor as the whole structure creaked around me. Charlie panicked completely. He jumped to his feet and started barking wildly, running in circles around the living room with his ears flat. His usual calm behavior was gone, replaced by pure fear. He kept looking toward the windows and then back at me, like he expected me to do something about whatever was happening. The noise just kept going and going. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it barely helped. The sound was everywhere and so loud that thinking became almost impossible. All I could do was stand there while my house shook around me. Charlie's barking got more scared. He'd never acted like this before, not even during thunderstorms or when sirens passed by our old apartment. This was different. This was fear. After what felt like forever but was probably closer to 10 minutes, the sound cut off. Just stopped, mid-noise, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt wrong. My ears hurt, and Charlie continued pacing for another few minutes before finally settling down, though he kept glancing toward the front door nervously. I looked around the living room, books all over the floor, a coffee mug knocked over on the side table, dust floating in the air from where it had been shaken loose from every surface. The whole house felt different somehow, like something was wrong with it. What the hell was that? I grabbed my phone and called Robert immediately. Wilson. Robert, it's Michael Thompson. Something just happened at the house. There was this massive noise, like an earthquake or explosion or something. The whole place shook. Is everything okay? A pause. Too long of a pause. Oh, that. Yeah, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Robert, it sounded like a bomb went off. The windows were shaking. Books fell everywhere. What was it? Just the monthly noise. You'll get used to it. Monthly noise? I stared at Charlie, who was still keeping watch by the front window. What do you mean, monthly noise? What kind of noise happens every month that's strong enough to shake a house? Look, Michael, it's just something the town deals with. Has been for years. Nothing dangerous, just loud. You picked the place for quiet, right? Well, it's quiet 29 days out of 30. Not bad odds. His tone was so casual, so matter-of-fact, like he'd just told me about a weekly garbage pickup schedule. But what causes it? Where does it come from? That's just how things are here, You'll adjust. Everyone does. The line went quiet except for some background noise on his end, like he was outside doing yard work. Robert, I'm serious. That wasn't normal. That was... Michael. His voice got firmer. It happens every first Wednesday. It's been happening since before I moved here, and it'll keep happening after we're both gone. Best thing you can do is plan for it. Put your breakables somewhere safe next month. But I've got to go. Call me if you have any real problems. He hung up. I stood there holding my phone, trying to process what had just happened. Not the noise. That was disturbing enough on its own, but Robert's reaction. The way he'd dismissed it like it was completely normal for a sound that powerful to shake an entire town once a month. Charlie finally stopped pacing and came over to lean against my legs. I scratched behind his ears and he looked up at me with an expression that seemed to say he was just as confused as I was. Just the monthly noise, I said out loud, testing how that sounded. It sounded like complete nonsense. I walked around the living room, picking up books and straightening picture frames. Everything seemed fine structurally. No cracks in the walls, no broken windows. Whatever had happened, it hadn't caused any real damage. Just disruption. But Robert's response bothered me more than the noise itself. The casual way he'd brushed off my concerns, like I was overreacting to something as mundane as a garbage truck. The way he'd cut off the conversation when I pressed for details. I'd moved to Millfield for peace and quiet, but apparently I'd signed up for something else entirely. Something the longtime residents treated as normal, but that felt anything but normal to me. Charlie settled back down on the floor, though he kept his ears perked up and his eyes watching the front of the house. Even he seemed to understand that whatever had just happened wasn't finished yet, just paused. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning up and thinking. Every first Wednesday. That's what Robert had said. Which meant this would happen again in exactly 4 weeks. The question was whether I'd be ready for it next time, or whether I'd spend the next month trying to figure out what I'd gotten myself into. The smell of coffee and bacon grease hit me as soon as I walked through the glass door of Murphy's Diner. I'd spent most of the night replaying Robert's dismissive phone call, and by morning I decided that if the locals treated yesterday's super loud noise as normal, maybe I could learn something by talking to a few more of them. The diner looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Red vinyl booths lined the windows facing Main Street, and a long counter stretched along the back wall with swivel stools that had seen better decades. The black and white checkered floor showed wear patterns where generations of customers had walked the same paths from door to counter to booth. Only one other person was there. An elderly man hunched over a coffee cup at the far end of the counter. His white hair was thin enough that I could see his scalp underneath, and he wore a faded flannel shirt that looked like it had been through countless wash cycles. "Morning." A woman emerged from behind the counter, coffee pot already in hand. She had shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of easy smile that made you feel welcome immediately. Her name tag read, "Trish. You must be the new guy everyone's been talking about. Coffee?" "Please." I slid onto a stool a few seats down from the elderly man, leaving some space but close enough that we could all talk if the mood struck. "I'm Michael, renting the house over on Pine Street." "Trish Kelly. Been working here about 8 years now." She poured coffee into a thick white mug and set it in front of me. "How are you settling in? Finding everything you need?" "Pretty well, thanks. Still getting used to small-town life after living in the city." The old man looked up from his coffee for the first time. His pale blue eyes looked tired, like he'd been through a lot over the years. "Sam Baker," he said with a small nod. "You picked a good place to land. Quiet most of the time. Most of the time. Interesting phrasing. That's actually what I was hoping for," I said, taking a sip of coffee that was stronger than I'd expected. Though yesterday afternoon was anything but quiet. That noise was incredible. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Trish's smile faded and disappeared. She set the coffee pot down with more force than necessary and grabbed a dish rag from under the counter. Sam's shoulders tensed, and he went back to looking down at his mug. "What noise?" Trish asked, but she was already moving away from me, wiping down a section of counter that looked spotless. The thundering sound that shook my entire house yesterday around 4 o'clock went on for about 10 minutes. My dog went crazy. "Oh." Trish moved to the next section of counter, scrubbing at invisible stains. "That." Sam muttered something into his coffee that sounded like just how things are around here. I leaned forward slightly, trying to catch his attention. "Do you know what causes it? It was loud enough to rattle windows and knock books off shelves." "Don't really think about it much," Sam said without looking up. Trish had worked her way down to the far end of the counter, as far from me as she could get, while still technically being in the same conversation. She started rearranging the sugar dispensers and napkin holders with the focused intensity of someone trying very hard to look busy. "But it must happen regularly if you don't think about it," I pressed. "How often does something like that occur?" "Sometimes these old buildings make noise," Trish said quickly. Her voice had lost all its earlier warmth. "Settling, happens." I looked around the diner. Whatever had hit yesterday would have shaken this place just as hard as my house. That wasn't settling. That was like standing next to a freight train. Sam finished his coffee in one long gulp and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill from his shirt pocket. He put it on the counter and got up from his stool. "Nice meeting you, Michael," he said, but he was already heading for the door. "Wait, Sam." The door closed behind him, with a soft chime from the bell mounted above it. Through the window, I watched him walk down Main Street with the measured pace of someone who wasn't running away, but definitely wasn't sticking around either. Trish appeared at my elbow with a menu, though I hadn't asked for one. "What can I get you for breakfast? The pancakes are really good today." "I'm more curious about—" "Oh, excuse me." She hurried toward the back of the diner, calling out toward the kitchen. "Tom, I need to take this order." I looked around the empty restaurant. There was no Tom in sight, and definitely no other customers who needed their orders taken. Trish went through the swinging doors to what I guessed was the kitchen, leaving me alone with my coffee and the feeling that I'd hit on something nobody wanted to talk about. The whole interaction felt rehearsed, like these people knew exactly how to avoid questions about yesterday's noise. Robert's casual brush-off now made more sense, not because the sound was actually normal, but because the locals had agreed not to talk about it with outsiders. I sat there for another few minutes, hoping Trish would come back and maybe be more willing to give me straight answers. The coffee was good, and the diner had that comfortable, worn-in feel of a place where people had been hanging out for decades. But the comfortable feeling was ruined by the obvious discomfort my simple question had caused. When Trish finally came back from the kitchen, she was busy like she was handling a dinner rush, even though I was still the only customer. She refilled my coffee without looking at me and started wiping down tables that already looked clean. "So, about that noise yesterday. You know what? I just remembered I need to prep for the lunch crowd," she said, not looking up from the table she was scrubbing. "Rain check on breakfast?" It wasn't really a question. The message was clear. This conversation was over. I left money on the counter and headed for the door. As I pushed it open, I caught Trish glancing up at me with an expression that looked almost apologetic, but she quickly turned away and went back to her unnecessary cleaning. Walking back down Main Street, I thought about the way both Sam and Trish had reacted. Not confused or curious about what I meant. Not dismissive in the way people are when they think you're overreacting to something minor. They knew exactly what noise I was talking about, and they wanted nothing to do with discussing it. Charlie was waiting by the front door when I got home, tail wagging but ears still more alert than usual. I scratched behind his ears and looked around the living room where I'd carefully restacked all the books that had fallen during the noise. Whatever was happening in Millfield once a month, the locals had clearly decided that the less said about it, the better, which only made me more determined to figure out what they were all so eager to keep quiet. The idea came to me 3 days after my uncomfortable breakfast at Murphy's Diner. I'd been turning over Sam and Trish's reactions in my head, trying to make sense of their obvious discomfort whenever I brought up the monthly noise. Their responses felt too practiced, too coordinated for something they claimed was just routine building settling or municipal background noise. I needed answers that didn't depend on people who clearly had no intention of giving them to me. The Millfield Public Library sat on Center Street, a small brick building that looked like it had been built sometime in the 1960s. I'd driven past it dozens of times, but never had a reason to go inside until now. Charlie stayed home while I made my first visit on a Thursday morning, figuring the local records might give me some perspective on what I'd moved into. The librarian was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and thick-rimmed glasses who looked up from her computer screen when I approached the front desk. "Can I help you find something? I'm interested in local history, newspaper archives, town records, that kind of thing. I'm new to the area and curious about Millfield's background." She brightened immediately, like I'd just asked about her favorite hobby. "Oh, wonderful. We have quite a collection. The historical section is over here." She led me to a corner area with several filing cabinets and 2 microfiche machines that looked like they belonged in a museum. Stacks of bound newspaper volumes filled the shelves along the walls, dating back to the 1930s. "The Millfield Gazette runs back to 1938, she explained, pulling out a thick volume. "These are the original papers through 1960, and we have everything after that on microfiche. Town meeting minutes, property records, and census data are in these cabinets. Let me know if you need help with the machines." I started with the most recent newspaper volumes and worked backward, looking for any mention of unusual sounds, monthly disturbances, or complaints about noise. The Millfield Gazette was exactly what I'd expected from a small-town paper. Coverage of school board meetings, local business openings, high school sports scores, and the occasional minor crime report. After 2 hours of reading about bake sales and zoning disputes, I'd found absolutely nothing about monthly noise events. Not a single article, letter to the editor, or even classified ad that referenced anything like what I'd experienced 3 weeks ago. That was strange enough on its own. If something powerful enough to shake houses had been happening every month for years, wouldn't there be some record of it? Some mention of property damage, noise complaints, or at least curiosity from residents? I switched to the town meeting minutes, thinking maybe local government would have addressed the issue more directly. Those records proved just as unhelpful. Month after month of discussions about road maintenance, snow removal budgets, and permit applications. Nothing about investigating mysterious sounds or addressing resident concerns about monthly disturbances. By afternoon, I'd expanded my search to police reports and incident records. The librarian helped me access boxes of files that contained copies of official documents dating back to the 1940s. Most of it was routine small-town law enforcement. Petty theft, traffic violations, domestic disputes, the occasional drunk and disorderly. But buried in those routine reports, I started noticing something else. Missing persons cases. Not many, but they appeared with unsettling regularity over the decades. People who'd been in Millfield one day and simply vanished the next, leaving behind no forwarding address, no explanation, no trace of where they'd gone. I pulled out every missing persons report I could find and spread them across the library table. The pattern became clearer as I organized them chronologically. 1943, John Morrison, age 34, described as a transient laborer seeking work. Last seen at the local boarding house. No follow-up investigation found in the files. 1946, Mary Ellen Schultz, age 28, traveling through town en route to family in Burlington. Car found abandoned on Route 108. Brief search conducted, case closed after 1 week. 1951, Robert Chen, age 31, salesman from New York. Checked into Murphy's boarding house, apparently the same building that now housed Murphy's Diner, never checked out. Belongings left behind, no charges filed for theft. The reports continued through the decades, with gaps of anywhere from 2 to 5 years between cases. Each file contained the same basic elements. Someone from out of town, here temporarily, disappeared without explanation. and in every case the investigation seemed perfunctory at best. 1958. Thomas Bradley, age 29, hitchhiker passing through. Last seen asking for directions on Main Street. 1963. Patricia Moreau, age 35, visiting the area for work. Car found in the woods off Route 108, no sign of struggle. 1967. James Sullivan, age 27, traveling salesman. Checked into local motel, disappeared overnight. The latest case I found was from 1974. William Hayes, 42, a traveling salesman from Connecticut. According to the report, he'd checked into the Millfield Motor Lodge on a Tuesday evening and didn't check out the next morning. His car sat in the parking lot for 3 days before the motel owner called police. A quick search of the area turned up nothing, and they closed the case within a week, just assuming Hayes had continued on his route by other means. I read that last report 3 times. I couldn't believe how little effort went into finding a missing person. No interviews with locals who might have seen him. No calls to his employer or family back in Connecticut. Just a quick look around town, and they basically shrugged it off. The thing that bothered me most was how all these people fit the same profile. Outsiders. People passing through who wouldn't be missed by local residents. Travelers who had no connections to anyone in Millfield. People like me, actually. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the stack of files spread across the table. 23 missing persons cases over 30-plus years. All involving people who weren't from Millfield. All investigated with what seemed like deliberate superficiality. The timing bothered me too. While the disappearances weren't frequent, usually 1 or 2 every few years, they were remarkably consistent. No long gaps where the phenomenon stopped completely, no sudden clusters where multiple people vanished in short periods. Just a steady, predictable pattern stretching back to the 1940s. Right around the time Robert Wilson had mentioned the monthly noise starting. I spent another hour going through the files, looking for any detail I might have missed. A few of the reports mentioned the missing person's vehicle being found abandoned on Route 108, always somewhere in the woods outside town. Others noted that personal belongings had been left behind in motel rooms or boarding houses, as though the people had stepped out briefly and never returned. But what really got me was the attitude in the police reports themselves. The language was formal but dismissive, like the cops expected these people to disappear and weren't really surprised when they did. No urgency, no apparent concern that something might be happening to endanger travelers in their community. By closing time, I'd photocopied every missing persons report and organized them by date. The librarian helped me locate a few additional newspaper articles that mentioned some of the disappearances, but those were brief and unhelpful. Mostly just notices that someone had gone missing and anyone with information should contact local police. Walking back to my car with my stack of photocopies, I felt more and more sure that Millfield's monthly noise and its history of missing outsiders were connected somehow. I couldn't see how yet, couldn't understand what one thing had to do with the other. But the timing was too coincidental, and the locals' reluctance to discuss either topic felt like more than simple small-town privacy. I spread the photocopied reports across my kitchen table and read through them again, looking for patterns I might have missed. The more I studied those files, the more convinced I became that whatever was happening in Millfield once a month, it had been claiming victims for decades. And everyone in town who mattered, the police, the local officials, probably most of the longtime residents, knew about it and had decided to look the other way. The question was whether I'd stumbled into something I could safely ignore, or whether my status as an outsider put me in the same category as all those people who'd checked into local motels and never checked out. I'd been carrying those photocopied missing persons reports around in my head for 3 weeks now, and the weight of them had changed how I saw everything in Millfield. Walking down Main Street felt different when you knew 23 people had vanished here over the decades. The friendly nods from neighbors took on a different quality when you wondered what they might know about those disappearances. Charlie needed his evening walk, and I'd taken to avoiding the streets after dark, preferring the wooded area behind my house where I wouldn't run into any locals who might want to chat. The trees felt safer somehow, even though that didn't make much logical sense. At least in the woods, I could see Charlie's reactions to our surroundings, and his instincts had proven more reliable than my own since we'd moved here. The November air carried a sharp bite that made me pull my jacket tighter as we followed the worn path that started at my back fence and wound deeper into the forest. Charlie trotted ahead with his nose to the ground, investigating the scents left by whatever animals used these trails during the day. The familiar routine of our walk usually helped clear my head, but tonight my thoughts kept circling back to those police reports. Charlie stopped suddenly about 20 yards ahead of me, his ears perked and head tilted toward something deeper in the woods. He let out a soft whine that meant he detected movement. Not danger exactly, but something worth paying attention to. I caught up to him and listened, hearing what sounded like someone pushing through the undergrowth with more noise than any local hunter would make. "Hello." The voice came from somewhere to our left, beyond a cluster of pine trees. "Is someone there? I could really use some help." A man came out from behind the trees, stumbling slightly over a fallen branch. He was wearing a Pennsylvania State University sweatshirt that was torn in a couple places from pushing through the brush, and his jeans were dirty at the knees like he'd been crawling around on the ground. The guy looked completely out of place in the Vermont woods, like someone who belonged on a college campus rather than hiking through unfamiliar forest in the dark. "Oh, thank God," he said when he spotted me. "I've been wandering around for over an hour trying to find my way back to the road." Charlie moved closer to my side, but didn't show any of the agitation he'd displayed during the monthly noise incident. The stranger seemed to pose no immediate threat, just genuine confusion and relief at finding another human being. "I'm David Martinez," he said, extending a hand as he approached. "My car broke down on Route 108, maybe 2 miles outside of town. I tried to walk to find help, but somehow I ended up going in completely the wrong direction." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact of someone who had no reason to be suspicious of strangers. "Michael Thompson, this is Charlie. Nice to meet you both." David looked around at the trees surrounding us, then back at me with an expression that mixed embarrassment with growing concern. "I don't suppose you know which way leads back to the main road?" I'm starting to think I'm more lost than I realized. I felt really worried as I processed what David had just told me. Car broken down outside town, wandering alone in the woods. He wasn't from around here. That was obvious from his accent and the way he kept looking around like nothing looked familiar. This was exactly the profile I'd read about in all those missing persons reports. "Where were you headed originally?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. "Burlington. I was driving up from Pennsylvania to visit some friends at UVM." He gestured toward his sweatshirt with a self-conscious smile. "Graduate school reunion thing. I've never been to this part of Vermont before, so when my car started making that grinding noise, I just pulled over at the first safe spot I could find. An outsider, traveling alone, no local connections. Someone who wouldn't be missed for at least a few days while his friends assumed he was still driving up from Pennsylvania." "Is there a gas station or mechanic around here?" David continued. "I figured a small town like this would have someone who could help, or at least let me use a phone to call roadside assistance." I didn't answer right away, which was silly. The guy needed help with a broken-down car, and I was standing there acting like he'd asked me to commit a crime. But I kept thinking about those police reports. 23 people over 30 years. All of them outsiders. All of them disappeared without explanation. Charlie sat down between us, looking up at me with the patient look he got when he was waiting for me to make a decision about which direction to walk. David noticed my pause and glanced between me and the dog, probably wondering why a simple question about local services was taking so long to answer. "There's a mechanic in town," I said finally. "Murphy's service station on Main Street." "That's great. Could you point me in the right direction?" I feel like I've been walking in circles for the past hour. The smart thing would be to give him directions back to Route 108 and let him figure out the rest. Point him toward the main road, wish him luck, and forget I'd ever met him. David seemed like a decent guy. But whatever was happening in Millfield to make outsiders disappear, getting involved probably wouldn't help either of us. But looking at him standing there in his college sweatshirt, completely unaware that he'd wandered into a town with a 30-year history of missing persons cases, I couldn't shake the feeling that giving him directions to Main Street might be signing his death warrant. David was still waiting for an answer, and I realized I'd been standing there in silence long enough to make the situation awkward. He had no idea that his presence in Millfield might put him in serious danger, though I couldn't yet comprehend the full extent of that threat. The decision was taken away from me before I could make it. Two guys came out from the darkness between the pine trees. They walked really quietly, like they knew these woods well. I recognized them both from town. One was the guy who worked at the hardware store with a baseball cap. The other looked familiar from Murphy's Diner. Maybe someone I'd seen sitting in the back booth during my uncomfortable breakfast with Trish and Sam. Both men carried hunting rifles, holding them casually but ready. They walked toward us carefully. There was something about the way they came up to us that made me think they'd done this many times before. David noticed them at the same time I did, turning toward the sound of their footsteps with the same relief he'd shown when he first saw me. "Oh, hey there," David called out, raising his hand in a friendly wave. "I'm really glad to see more people. I've been lost for over an hour trying to find my way back to Route 108. The two men didn't respond immediately. They just continued their approach, moving to both sides of David with what looked like planned movements. Neither of them acknowledged my presence at all, like I wasn't standing 15 feet away with my dog. Their complete ignoring of me seemed on purpose, as if they'd already decided I wasn't part of whatever was about to happen. Charlie pressed against my legs, his body tense and a low whine building in his throat. The sound was barely audible, but I could feel the vibration of his anxiety through the contact with my jeans. His instincts were picking up something I was just beginning to understand. David looked between the two men as they positioned themselves on either side of him, his expression changing from relief to mild confusion. He still didn't seem afraid, just puzzled by their silent approach and the way they were standing so close to him. "I'm David Martinez," he said, trying to maintain his friendly tone despite the strange situation. "My car broke down on the main road and I was trying to walk to town to find help." The taller man finally spoke, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "We'll help you with your car trouble, guide you back to the road." The words sounded reasonable enough, but something about the way he said them gave me the creeps. There was no warmth in his tone, no curiosity about David's situation or concern for someone who'd been wandering lost in the woods. He spoke like he was reading from a script he'd memorized long ago. "That would be great," David said, genuine gratitude in his voice. "I was starting to worry I'd be stuck out here all night." The second man gestured toward the deeper woods with his rifle, pointing in a direction that led away from town and away from any roads that would actually help David get back to his car. When David hesitated, looking uncertain about the direction they wanted him to go, the first man placed a hand on his shoulder. "This way," he said simply. David looked back at me, probably expecting some kind of confirmation or goodbye, but I couldn't move. The whole interaction felt wrong, like it was fake in a way that made my stomach turn. These men weren't really trying to help. They were pushing David somewhere specific, somewhere that had nothing to do with getting him back to Route 108. The way they acted, how smoothly they approached him, how they didn't care about his actual situation. It all made me think about those missing persons reports I'd studied at the library. All those outsiders who'd vanished without a trace. All those cases that were shut down within days with barely any effort to find the missing people. Charlie's whine got louder, and he pushed harder against my legs like he was trying to keep me in place. Everything inside me was telling me I should say something, do something, follow them to see where they were taking David. but a deeper part of me was saying to stay exactly where I was and pretend I'd never seen any of this. The three men began walking deeper into the forest, with David walking between the two armed guys. He still didn't fight back, still seemed to think they were helping him, but I could see him looking around at the thick trees and wondering why they were heading away from any clear path or trail. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I heard him ask as they moved farther from where I stood. One of the men replied, but their voices were getting too distant for me to make out the words. Whatever they told him seemed to satisfy his concerns, because he continued walking with them without protest. I watched them disappear into the darkness between the trees, David's pale sweatshirt the last thing visible before the forest swallowed all three of them completely. The sounds of their movement faded until the woods returned to their normal nighttime quiet, leaving me standing there with Charlie pressed against my legs and the terrible certainty that I'd just witnessed something I was never supposed to see. My hands were shaking as I reached down to scratch Charlie's ears, more for my own comfort than his. He looked up at me with eyes that showed the same nervousness I was feeling, like he understood that whatever had just happened was fundamentally wrong. The silence stretched around us, broken only by the distant sound of an owl calling from somewhere deeper in the forest. I kept staring at the spot where the three figures had vanished, half expecting them to reappear and reveal that this had all been some kind of misunderstanding. But the woods remained empty, and the feeling in my gut told me that David Martinez was never going to make it to his reunion in Burlington. I pushed through the door of Murphy's Diner before 8 o'clock, my mind still spinning from what I'd seen in the woods the night before. Sleep had been impossible after watching those two men lead David Martinez into the darkness, and I'd spent the hours until dawn pacing my living room while Charlie watched me with worried eyes. Sam Baker sat in his usual spot at the far end of the counter, hunched over a steaming mug of coffee. His white hair showed under the overhead lights as he stared into the dark liquid, and for a moment I wondered if he already knew why I was there. The diner was empty except for us. Trish was nowhere to be seen, probably in the back getting things ready for the breakfast rush that wouldn't start for another hour. I walked directly to the counter and took the stool next to Sam's. He looked up at me with his pale blue eyes, and I saw something flash across his face when he saw my expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of tired recognition, like he'd been expecting this conversation for a while. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice low even though we were alone. Sam set his coffee mug down carefully and looked around the empty diner, checking the kitchen door and the front windows as though he wanted to make sure no one else was coming. The gesture was automatic, practiced, like something he'd done countless times before when discussing topics that required privacy. "I saw what happened last night in the woods," I continued. "There was a guy from Pennsylvania, David Martinez. He was lost, looking for help with his broken-down car. Two men with rifles showed up and took him away." Sam's face went pale so quickly I thought he might pass out. His rough hands grabbed the counter edge, knuckles turning white as he took in what I'd just told him. For a few seconds he didn't speak, just stared at me with a look that mixed fear, giving up, and something that seemed almost like relief. "You shouldn't have been out there," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But I was, and I saw everything. I leaned closer, studying his reaction. "I know about the missing persons reports, too. 23 people over 30 years, all outsiders, all disappeared without proper investigations." Sam closed his eyes and took a shuddering breath. When he opened them again, he looked older somehow, like admitting the truth out loud had aged him years in the span of a few seconds. He pointed to the booth in the corner, away from the windows and the kitchen door. "Sit down," he said, sliding off his stool with movements that seemed to require significant effort. "If you're going to hear this, you need to hear all of it." We moved to the corner booth, Sam carrying his coffee with hands that shook noticeably. He settled into the worn vinyl seat across from me and wrapped his fingers around the mug like he needed the warmth. The fluorescent light above our table buzzed softly, and somewhere in the kitchen I could hear the low buzz of refrigeration units cycling on and off. Sam stared into his coffee for a long moment before speaking, his voice taking on a flat, defeated quality that made my skin crawl. "The noise started in 1943, he said. "I was 13 years old, living with my parents in the house where the Hendersons live now. It began in March, first Wednesday of the month, just like it happens now." He paused to take a sip of coffee, his hand still trembling slightly. The cup rattled against the saucer when he set it down. At first, we thought it was something natural, maybe blasting for a quarry or construction project somewhere nearby. But it kept happening, every month, same day, same time. And it got worse. I watched his face as he spoke, noting the way his eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the diner walls, like he was seeing events from decades ago playing out in front of him. By the second year, people were going crazy from it. The sound wasn't just loud, it was destructive. Houses shook apart. Windows broke every month. Livestock died from the stress. People couldn't sleep for days afterward, and some folks started talking about moving away entirely. Sam picked up his coffee again, but instead of drinking, he just held it close to his chest like a shield. Nobody knew what was causing it. We brought in experts from Burlington, even had some government people come down to investigate. Nothing. No geological explanation, no industrial source, no military testing in the area. It was just this thing that happened to us, month after month, tearing our town apart. The way he described it made me think of the experience I'd had 3 weeks ago, but magnified beyond what I could imagine. The 10 minutes I'd endured had been overwhelming enough. I couldn't picture living through that repeatedly, knowing it would return every month without fail. "How long did this go on?" I asked. 5 years, Sam said. 5 years of our town slowly dying. People were leaving, businesses were closing, and those of us who stayed were getting desperate. The sound was getting stronger too, like whatever was causing it was feeding off our misery. He set his coffee down and looked directly at me for the first time since we'd sat down. His pale blue eyes held a depth of exhaustion that spoke to decades of carrying unbearable knowledge. Then, in the summer of 1948, something happened by accident. A traveling salesman named Robert Chen was staying at Murphy's boarding house when the noise hit. He ran outside during the sound, completely panicked, and got lost in the woods. We found him 3 days later, dead from exposure. Sam's voice grew even quieter, forcing me to lean forward to hear him clearly. The next month, the noise was different. Still loud, still terrible, but shorter. It only lasted about 7 minutes instead of the usual 20. People noticed, started talking about it. Some folks thought maybe the sound was finally weakening on its own. I had a sinking feeling about where this story was headed, but I let Sam continue without interruption. 2 months later, another outsider died during the noise. A woman whose car had broken down outside town. She panicked when the sound started and ran into the forest, just like Robert Chen had. We found her body the next day. Sam's hands were shaking more noticeably now, and he clasped them together on the table to try to control the tremor. That month, the noise only lasted 5 minutes, and it was quieter, less destructive. That's when people started to understand the connection. The pieces were falling into place in my mind, creating a picture so horrible I almost didn't want Sam to confirm what I was thinking. But I needed to hear him say it. Needed to know for certain what I'd stumbled into by moving to Millfield. "You're telling me the noise stops when someone dies," I said. Sam nodded slowly, his eyes closing as though the admission caused him physical pain. At first, people tried to convince themselves it was just coincidence, but the pattern was too clear to ignore. When an outsider died during the noise, it would be shorter and less severe the next month. If no one died, it got worse. He opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression that begged for understanding, even as he prepared to confess something unforgivable. By 1950, the town was desperate. The noise was destroying everything we'd built here. So a group of the older residents made a decision. They decided that if the death of outsiders could control the noise, then maybe they could arrange for those deaths to happen more reliably. The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. I felt sick to my stomach, but I forced myself to keep listening. They started watching for travelers, people passing through who wouldn't be missed immediately. When the first Wednesday of the month approached, they'd make sure those people encountered some kind of accident during the noise. Sam's voice had dropped to barely a whisper, and I could see tears forming in the corners of his eyes. It worked. The noise became manageable, still awful, but brief enough that people could endure it. The town survived. I stared at this elderly man sitting across from me, trying to reconcile the image of someone's kindly grandfather with what he was describing. The casual way he discussed decades of planned murders made my head spin. And it's been happening ever since, I said. It wasn't a question. Every month for over 30 years. Sometimes people wander in by accident, like your friend David. When that happens, He paused, searching for words that might make the horror sound more acceptable. We take care of it. The euphemism made everything worse somehow. These people had turned systematic murder into something they discussed in terms polite enough for a church social. The two men I saw in the woods, I said. They knew exactly what they were doing. Sam nodded. We take turns. Everyone in town over 18 participates in the rotation. It's the only way to make sure the burden gets shared equally. The matter-of-fact way he described it, like they were talking about jury duty or volunteer work at the fire department, made me want to throw up. But I forced myself to keep asking questions, to understand the full scope of what I'd discovered. What happens to the bodies? There's a place in the woods, about 2 miles east of town. Deep enough that they're never found, but close enough that we can handle the work quickly. Sam's hands were shaking badly now, and he pressed them flat against the table to try to steady them. Decades of participating in this system had clearly taken a psychological toll, but not enough to make him stop. You have to understand, he said, his voice pleading. None of us wanted this. We tried everything else first. But when you've lived through what that noise can do, when you've seen your neighbors driven to madness and your town literally falling apart around you, you'll do anything to make it stop. I thought about my own experience with the monthly sound, how overwhelming and destructive those 10 minutes had been. Trying to imagine enduring that for hours, knowing it would happen again next month and keep getting worse, I could almost understand how desperate people might become. Almost, but not quite enough to excuse 30 years of murder. How many people know about this? I asked. Everyone, Sam said. You can't keep something like this secret in a town this size. Even the kids know, though we try to keep them away from the actual work until they're older. The size of the conspiracy was huge. An entire community, united in organized murder, generation after generation learning to accept it as the price of their survival. It explained everything I'd noticed about Millfield, the way conversation stopped when I asked about the noise, the practiced way Robert Wilson and Trish avoided my questions, the complete absence of the monthly event from any official records. The police reports, I said. All those missing persons cases with minimal investigation. Sheriff's been part of it since the beginning. The reports get filed because they have to be, but nobody expects them to lead anywhere. State police stay out of our business as long as we don't cause trouble elsewhere. Sam finished his coffee and set the empty mug down with a soft clink. His hands had steadied somewhat, as though confessing the truth had released some of the tension he'd been carrying. I know how this sounds, he said. I know what we are. But the alternative is watching our town die and our people suffer through something no human being should have to endure. I sat in silence, processing everything he'd told me. The worst part wasn't the murders themselves, it was how reasonable Sam made them sound. How the logic of survival had twisted an entire community into something monstrous, while allowing them to maintain the illusion that they were good people, making impossible choices. David Martinez, I said finally. What happened to him? Sam's shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked every one of his 78 years. He's gone, Sam said simply. And next Wednesday the noise will be tolerable instead of unbearable, and the month after that we'll all be able to sleep at night. The casual certainty in his voice was the most chilling thing he'd said yet. David Martinez had been reduced to a problem solved, a sacrifice made to maintain the town's horrible equilibrium. Every instinct I had screamed that I should leave this booth, leave this diner, leave this town, and never look back. But another part of me knew it was already too late for that. I'd seen too much, learned too much, and now I was part of Millfield's secret whether I wanted to be or not. Sam watched me struggle with the implications of what he'd revealed, his expression mixing sympathy with a kind of grim satisfaction. He'd kept this secret alone for decades, and now he had someone else who knew about it too. What happens now? I asked. Sam reached across the table and patted my hand with fingers that felt cold and papery. Now you go home and think about what I've told you. And next Wednesday, when the noise comes, you'll understand why it has to be this way. The walk home from Murphy's Diner felt longer than usual, even though my legs took me the same 4 blocks they always did. Sam's words kept playing in my head with each step. Now you go home and think about what I've told you. And next Wednesday, when the noise comes, you'll understand why it has to be this way. Charlie met me at the front door, tail wagging as usual. I scratched behind his ears, but I was just going through the motions while my mind was stuck on everything Sam told me in that corner booth. My dog knew something was off. He stuck closer to me as I moved around the house, watching me pace between the living room and kitchen. I made coffee I didn't drink and picked up a book I couldn't read. Every few minutes I caught myself standing at the front window, looking out at Main Street and wondering which of my neighbors had helped kill David Martinez. The guy from the hardware store with the baseball cap had been one of the men in the woods. Did Trish know what was happening when those 2 guys led David away? Did Robert Wilson? Realizing everyone in town was in on this made me sick. Every friendly wave from a neighbor, every casual chat at the post office, every nod at the grocery store, all while the whole community shared the secret of murder. Over the next few days, I checked bus schedules and rental truck companies. Leaving Millfield would be easy enough. Pack my stuff, get Charlie in the car, and drive away from this place where people disappeared into the woods, and nobody talked about it again. My rent was month to month, so I wouldn't even lose money by breaking a lease, but something kept me from going. Maybe it was the cheap rent in a house that worked perfectly for me. Maybe I didn't want to uproot my life again after finally settling somewhere. Or maybe it was something darker, being fascinated by a secret that had shaped this whole town for decades. I told myself I was staying because leaving suddenly might make people wonder what I knew. But it wasn't that simple. Part of me wanted to see what happened next, to understand how a town like Millfield lived with this terrible knowledge. The days passed in a weird kind of limbo. I worked on my freelance stuff, walked Charlie, bought groceries at the small market on Center Street. But everything seemed different now. When Trish smiled at me through the diner window, I wondered if she'd helped plan David's death. When I saw the sheriff's car parked outside the town hall, I thought about all those missing persons reports filed and quickly forgotten. Charlie seemed to pick up on how nervous I was. During our evening walks, he stayed closer to me and avoided the path toward the woods where I'd met David. We stuck to the streets in the small park near the library, places that felt safer even though I knew the danger in Millfield wasn't random. It was organized, planned, and set for the first Wednesday of every month. As the next first Wednesday got closer, I found myself counting down the days with a mix of fear and curiosity. Sam had said the noise would be bearable instead of awful because of David's sacrifice. I wanted to feel the difference, to understand what the town had traded a man's life for. The morning of the noise came gray and cold, with November clouds hanging over the town. I spent the day organizing files and checking email, but kept looking at the clock every few minutes. Charlie seemed jumpy too, walking between his spot by the couch and the front door, like he knew something was coming. At 3:45 p.m., I closed my laptop and went to the middle of the living room. Charlie sat next to me, close enough that I could feel his fur against my leg. We waited together in the quiet house, both knowing what was about to happen. When the noise started at exactly 3:47, I noticed right away that Sam was right. The sound was still overwhelming, still strong enough to shake the windows and knock books off their shelves. But it wasn't the brutal, house-shaking force I'd felt during my first month in Millfield. This was somehow contained, like the town's horrible deal had actually worked. Charlie whined and pressed against my legs, but he didn't freak out like before. Even he could tell the difference. I sat on the floor next to him and hugged his shaking body while the loud rumble filled our living room. But knowing what it cost made everything so much worse. As the sound filled the house, I couldn't stop thinking about David Martinez lying somewhere in the woods east of town. His body was feeding this thing, making its power less through his death. The noise we were dealing with was the discounted version, paid for with an innocent life. The 10 minutes seemed endless. Every second felt like hours while I sat there holding Charlie and thinking about David's college sweatshirt, his friendly handshake, his relief at finding help in the woods. He'd trusted the two men who took him away, never guessing that his broken-down car had made him a target for something awful. When the noise finally stopped, the silence felt worse than before. Charlie relaxed against me, but I couldn't shake the tension that had built up during those 10 minutes. The sound was over for another month, but knowing what it meant would never leave me. I spent that evening looking up David Martinez online, something I probably should have done weeks earlier. His social media showed a graduate student in engineering who posted pictures of hiking trips and shared articles about the environment. His last post was about driving to Vermont for his reunion, with a photo of his car packed for the trip. No one had reported him missing yet. His friends probably thought he was still visiting Burlington, maybe extending his trip or taking a detour. It would be days, maybe weeks, before anyone started looking for him. And when they did, the search would follow the same pattern as all the others. Short, basic, and quickly closed. December came with early snow that covered the roads and made driving dangerous. I found myself watching for out-of-state license plates, cars that might belong to people passing through town. Each time I spotted one, I wondered if the driver would become Millfield's next monthly offering. I started to see how I was becoming part of this during those winter months. I never called the police about David's disappearance. I never contacted his university or tried to reach his family. When people asked about my first few months in Millfield, I described it as quiet and peaceful, never mentioning the missing persons reports or what I'd seen in the woods. My silence made me part of the conspiracy. Every day I chose not to speak was another day I helped protect the town's secret. I told myself I was being practical, that reporting what I knew wouldn't bring David back and would only ruin the lives of people stuck in an impossible situation. But the truth was simpler and worse. I was scared. Scared of what might happen if I tried to expose the town's secret. Scared of becoming the next person who disappeared. Millfield had survived for over 30 years by making sure everyone who knew the truth had a reason to keep quiet. Now I understood why that system worked. January brought another first Wednesday, and with it, the same feeling of dread. Charlie and I got in the living room again, waiting for the monthly noise. It arrived on schedule, controlled and brief, lasting exactly as long as David's sacrifice had bought us. As I held my dog and listened to the loud noise, I found myself wondering who else might accidentally end up in Millfield before the next first Wednesday. Would it be another college student with car trouble? A salesman whose GPS sent him down the wrong road? A hiker who got lost in the surrounding woods? The worst part was realizing that I didn't know what I would do if I met another David Martinez. Would I have the guts to warn them about what they'd stumbled into? Would I try to help them escape before the two men with rifles showed up? Or would I stay quiet and let the town's survival system claim another victim? I probably already knew the answer, and it made me sick. The months in Millfield had changed me in ways I was just starting to understand. I'd learned to live with terrible knowledge, to act normal while knowing about systematic murder. I'd become someone who could sit through 10 minutes of loud noise and feel thankful it wasn't worse, even though I knew exactly what price had been paid to make it easier. Charlie looked up at me with trusting eyes as the noise continued around us, and I scratched behind his ears while wondering if I'd already become the kind of person who could watch an innocent stranger disappear into the woods without saying anything to stop it.